So, this is a tricky one to discuss. Last week, the Financial Times reported that Ukraine's President Zelensky was being accused of authoritarian slide. Various other journals picked up on the theme as well. Today it was reported that Ukraine's parliament has voted to endorse the president's wish for greater control over the country's independent anti-corruption bodies, a move that some have seen as a worrying further step in that authoritarian direction. There are some very hard questions to be answered in all of this. They may not be the ones that you would expect. And it's difficult to discuss because there is, of course, a horde of hungry Russian bots, some of whom you may find in the comments below this video, just waiting to jump onto such a discussion. We can ignore them. Where this goes does not line up with their propaganda in the way that they would wish. Their mere existence, though, rather feeds into the discussion we're about to have. So, for once, maybe their presence is actually quite useful, as a reminder if nothing else. Alright, well, let's start with the facts about what's been happening and what's also being said about it. The accusations about the slide into authoritarianism came because of recent anti-corruption raids on prominent Ukrainian figures, with moves to promote loyalists into senior positions, which at first glance does kind of look like the sort of authoritarian tactics used by a Putin or an Orban or a Trump. Some politicians and activists say that Zelensky and his aides are using extraordinary powers granted under martial law to, quote, sideline critics, muzzle civil society leaders and consolidate control. This particularly came to a head when prominent anti-corruption campaigner Vitaly Shabunin was raided and his phone, laptop and tablet were seized. Former Infrastructure Minister Alexander Kubrakov was also raided. They said that the raids had been politically motivated. Shabunin told the Financial Times, "Zelensky is using my case to send a message to two groups that could pose a threat to him. The message is this: if I can go after Shabunin publicly under the scrutiny of the media and despite public support, then I can go after any one of you. The first group are journalists or activists exposing corruption. The second group is military personnel, because the charges against me relate to my military service." The State Bureau of Investigation said that the case against Shabunin was well-founded and supported by a decision by a district court in Kiev, which ordered him not to leave the country and to give up his passport. Shabunin had been a long-time anti-corruption campaigner and has got a lot of support in the country. Leading independent media leapt to his defence. So the FT quoted the editorial by Ukrainian Truth, the most read Ukrainian online news site. Taking advantage of a war, Zelensky is making his first yet confident steps towards corrupt authoritarianism. The English-language Kiev Independent ran an editorial saying that Ukraine's democracy risks a Russian-style backslide. While fighting a war of survival against Russia, Ukraine must not turn into its authoritarian neighbour, it said. A Western diplomat in Kiev, who the FT said has worked closely with Ukraine's civil society, said the cases of Shabunin and Kubrakov are not isolated events. They fit a pattern. Critics are being pushed aside. Loyalists are shielded. Today, legislation was passed that would eliminate the independence of the two anti-corruption bodies, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, or NABU, and the Specialised Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, or SAPO. The state prosecutor gains new powers to direct their investigations. Now, on the numbers, this was not a controversial vote. 263 lawmakers voted for this bill, just 13 voted against, 13 abstentions. But independent media certainly did hold it to be highly inflammatory. And so did others, including the European Union. The EU spokesperson Guillaume Mercier said that the bloc was, quote, concerned about Ukraine's recent actions with regard to its anti-corruption institutions, NABU and SAPO. These institutions are crucial to Ukraine's reform agenda and must operate independently to fight corruption and maintain public trust. The EU sternly reminded Ukraine that its financial backing hinges on an unwavering progress in democratic governance. Also worth noting that the Ukrainian security services have launched a series of raids on NABU, saying that they were investigating suspected collusion with Russian spies. 2 of the top NABU detectives were detained under suspicion of having been working as Russian moles. Those are some of the basic facts. Bear in mind, we miss a lot of local context, the political history and detail, inevitably, in these sorts of summaries. And that's also some of the noise around those facts. So let's get to the meat of the question here. And it's this: how authoritarian does a democratic state have to become and can be accepted to become during a time of an existential war? I saw one commentator slating Kyiv, saying that Zelensky should have learned from Winston Churchill, who, when Britain declared war on Nazi Germany, formed a national unity government, bringing in people from across the political aisle. Now again, I would say context is kind of important. None of the parties of government in the UK had a recent history of being targeted and infiltrated by the Germans at the time. I doubt Churchill would have been so quick to follow that course if they had. But in any case, let's stick with that analogy. Because here's the huge thing. In terms of an existential attack upon the integrity of a democratic nation, that really hasn't happened on this scale since World War II, 80 years ago. So yeah, what did Britain do during its war with Germany? Well, it passed 2 Emergency Power Acts, giving the government sweeping powers to pass regulations without parliamentary approval. It allowed for detention without trial, censorship, control of resources and conscription. It passed Regulation 18B, which allowed for the internment of individuals suspected of posing a threat to national security without charge or trial. That was used to detain fascists such as Oswald Mosley and others seen as enemy sympathisers. Also, then it interned Germans and Italians. Security forces monitored suspected subversives, pacifists, left-wing groups. Telephone tapping and mail interception were carried out without judicial oversight. The government created extensive blacklists and dossiers on citizens. The Ministry of Information controlled public messaging, newspapers, films, broadcasts. They were all censored. Elections were, of course, suspended. Are you feeling the nostalgia yet? Well, there was a lot more. But look, you get the general idea. And you know what? Mostly the people at the time were fine with all of that, because it was entirely clear to the people that Britain was at war. The enemy wasn't messing around. All those measures were about preventing them from weakening British resolve, their capacity to fight and win the war, because the costs of not doing so would be bad. So of course they said you couldn't have critics picking away at the war leaders when the fighting was going on. The enemy would make hay with that, with lots of disinformation and propaganda, the sort of thing that was, of course, illegal within their own country, within Nazi Germany, on a routine basis, not just in wartime. But that's not what Ukraine is doing now. Not even close. And the question follows: what should be the rules when a democracy is thrown into an existential war in the modern age? All those measures the British took were done for a reason. We've seen how weakened democracies have been in recent times when faced with problems and emergencies. During the COVID pandemic, the ability for grifters and Russian disinformation bots to spread wild rumours and fake news led to the politicisation of vaccine policy, a surge in distrust in any and all institutions that is still with us today, stronger than ever, arguably. Can you imagine trying to fight a war while your citizenry is picking through expertly crafted psychological messaging online designed to alienate them from their own fight for survival? It would be impossible, and I don't think any NATO country has fully absorbed the scale of the challenge that they would face in that situation. Now try to imagine, what would your country do in the modern era faced with an existential war? Would there be a patriotic pulling together in that situation? Would it be strong enough? Or would there be demonstrations in the streets like we had with the anti-vaxxer movements? And lots of fake memes circulating, purporting to show that the war was all a hoax or whatever they come up with. And this isn't easy because, of course, moments of crisis that mean emergency measures get brought in, they can become excuses that governments later then use to keep hold of those powers long after the emergency has ended. Indeed, many of Britain's emergency powers remained in force until 1951, 6 years after the war ended. Rationing went on for almost a decade after the war. ID cards had to be challenged in court before they were withdrawn. Some of the hangover was needed, but a lot of it wasn't. So yes, in a genuine emergency, more central control is likely crucial to success and survival. And also, that can then create problems of its own as governments can slide into getting used to authoritarianism. Now, I don't see that the current narrative of Ukraine, while the country right now is being bombarded heavily by drones and missiles, and Vladimir Putin has been granted a 50-day window to do whatever he can, I do not see that that fits this moment. Right now, arguably, Ukraine should be locked down as tightly as Britain was. And if it suspects that independent agencies are being used as a cover for enemy spies, then of course they should act against them. The idea that the European Union thinks that this is the time to lecture Ukraine about democratic governance, it just illustrates how completely unprepared our modern-day democracies are for what this ugly business involves. Bear in mind, during the COVID pandemic, the EU joined the rest in scrabbling and fighting hard for PPE and essential supplies, breaking rules and contracts and throwing its weight around with the best of them. Yeah, all the high-minded principles, they get tested when you get the genuine crisis. Right now, they're just handing a gift to the Russian propagandists, the enemies of Ukraine, who had already had such good fortune so far in successfully turning the US government and half of the political culture of America against Ukraine and to become favourably disposed toward Moscow. Putin's propaganda line for years has been that President Zelensky is not the legitimate leader because, of course, that's part of the process of trying to undermine the war leadership. So, if he can ride now on the anxieties of Westerners of creeping authoritarianism, that gives him another powerful wing to the bow. That isn't to argue, by the way, that in a future war, that Britain or Germany or indeed America or whoever should adopt the same laws that Britain did in World War II. It's just worth noting the huge difference between the expectations being laid on Ukraine today by the EU and others that make it much more difficult for them to prosecute the war successfully. I think all governments and all opposition politicians and all others come to that could do with spending some time trying to answer the question, what does it look like for a modern democracy in the information age to be involved in an existential war? Maybe lay off Ukraine until you've gotten some pretty good answers to that question for yourself.